Fyodor pressed the button and the elevator creaked slowly downward. From below came an icy cold draft of air. The elevator stopped. They passed into the huge storeroom. Muzzily, Nikolka saw a sight that he had never seen before. Piled one upon another like logs of wood lay naked, emaciated human bodies. Despite the sal ammoniac, the stench of decay was intolerable. Rows of legs, some rigid, some slack, protruded in layers. Women's heads lay with tangled and matted hair, their breasts slack, battered and bruised. "Right, now I'll turn them over and you look," said the janitor bending down. He grasped the corpse of a woman by the leg and the greasy body slithered to the floor with a thump. To Nikolka she seemed sticky and repulsive, yet at the same time horribly beautiful, like a witch. Her eyes were open and stared straight at Fyodor. With difficulty Nikolka tore his fascinated gaze from the scar which encircled her waist like a red ribbon, and looked away. His eyes clouded and his head began to spin at the thought that they might have to turn over every layer of that pile of sticky bodies. "That's enough. Stop," he said weakly to Fyodor and thrust the bottle of smelling salts into his pocket. "There he is." "I found him. On top. There, there." Moving carefully in order not to slip on the floor, Fyodor grasped Nai Turs by the head and pulled hard. A flat-chested, broad-hipped woman was lying face down across Nai's stomach. There was a cheap little comb in the hair at the back of her neck, glittering dully, like a fragment of glass. Without stopping what he was doing, Fyodor deftly pulled it out, dropped it into the pocket of his apron and gripped Nai Turs under the armpits. As it was pulled out of the pile, his head lolled back, his sharp, unshaven chin pointed upwards and one arm slipped from the janitor's grasp. Fyodor did not toss Nai aside as he had tossed the woman, but carefully holding him under the armpits and bending the dangling body, turned him so that Nai's legs swung round on the floor until the body directly faced Nikolka. He said, "Take a good look and see if it's him or not. We don't want any mistakes." Nikolka looked straight into Nai's glassy, wide-open eyes which stared back at him senselessly. His left cheek was already tinged green with barely detectable decay, and several large, dark patches of what was probably blood were congealed on his chest and stomach. "That's him," said Nikolka. Still gripping him under the armpits, Fyodor dragged Nai to the elevator and dropped him at Nikolka's feet. The dead man's arm was flung out wide, and once again his chin pointed upwards. Fyodor entered the elevator, pushed the button, and the cage moved upward. Hash. That night in the chapel everything was done as Nikolka had wanted it, and his conscience was quite calm, though sad and austere. The light shone in the bare, gloomy anatomical theater attached to the chapel. The lid was placed on another coffin standing in the corner, containing an unknown man, so that this ugly, unpleasant stranger should not disturb Nai's rest. Lying in his coffin, Nai himself had taken on a distinctly more cheerful look. Nai, washed by two well-bribed and talkative janitors, Nai, clean, in a tunic without badges, Nai, with a wreath on his forehead and 3 candles at the head of the bier, and, best of all, Nai wearing the bright ribbon of the St. George's Cross which Nikolka himself had arranged under the shirt on the cold, clammy chest and looped through one buttonhole. Her head shaking, Nai's old mother turned aside from the 3 candles to Nikolka and said to him, "My son." "Thank you, my dear." At this Nikolka burst into tears and went out of the chapel into the snow. All around, above the courtyard of the anatomical theater, was the night, the snow, crisscrossed stars and the white Milky Way. Alexei Turbin began dying on the morning of December 22. The day was a dull white and overcast, and full of the advent of Christmas. This was particularly noticeable in the shine on the parquet floor in the drawing room, polished by the joint efforts of Anyuta, Nikolka, and Lariusik, who had spent the whole of the day before silently rubbing back and forth. There was an equally Christmassy look about the silver holders of the icon lamps, polished by Anyuta's hands. And finally there was a smell of pine needles and a bright display of greenery in the corner by the piano, where the music of Faust was propped up, as though forgotten forever, above the open keys. At about midday Elena came out of Alexei's room with slightly unsteady steps and passed silently through the dining room where Karas, Myshlayevsky and Lariusik were sitting in complete silence. Not one of them moved as she passed by, afraid to look into her face. Elena closed the door of her room behind her and the heavy portiere fell back motionless into place. Myshlayevsky shifted in his seat. "Well," he said in a hoarse whisper, "the mortar regiment commander did his best, but he didn't manage to arrange for Alyosha to get away." Karas and Lariusik had nothing to add to this. Lariusik blinked, mauve shadows spreading across his cheeks. "Ah, hell," said Myshlayevsky. He stood up and tiptoed, swaying, to the door, then stopped irresolutely, turned round and winked toward Elena's door. "Look, fellows, keep an eye on her or she may." After a moment's hesitation he went out into the library, where his footsteps died away. A little later there came the sound of his voice and strange grieving noises from Nikolka's room. "Poor Nikolka is crying," Lariusik whispered in a despairing voice, then sighed, tiptoed to the door of Elena's room and bent over to the keyhole, but he could not see anything. He looked round helplessly at Karas and began making silent, questioning gestures. Karas walked over to the door, looked embarrassed, then plucked up courage and tapped on the door several times with his fingernail and said softly,